Hello, everyone, and welcome to Books Undone. I'm your host, Livia J. Elliot, and today we have a meta guest talk. Instead of covering a particular book, we are going a bit beyond to discuss storytelling in games, tabletops, or video games versus storytelling in books. Let me introduce you to my guest today, Dungeon Master and author Gregory Wunderling. Greg, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, everybody. I'm Gregory Wunderling, as explained. I'm an author, a TTRPG game designer, and professional dungeon master, which sounds really cool, but it's not that glamorous.
So, before we start, let me do the usual disclaimers. Since we are a bit meta today, we may mention other games, TTRPGs, RPGs, and video games, but we will try to keep those spoiler light or spoiler free as much as possible. Also, we will also be spoiler light regarding Greg's books. We might mention them, but we will try not to spoil anything. After that, please note that what you will hear is our subjective experience and opinion of writing both for games and books. Your experience as a writer, reader, or player may be different, and that's fine. I know that you have written expansions, classes for D&D 5e like The Witch, and you are also working on a D&D variant that we will touch in later. But when it comes to plot development, for example, as in a campaign, what is the biggest difference you have found between writing for games and books?
Man, I love this question because every time someone asks it to me, I think my answer changes just ever so slightly because I actually get more time to consider it. Because it's nothing you actually like. I never sit at my keyboard. I'm like, what is the difference between these two? I actually have time to like actually think about it and consider it for a minute, which is really cool. Well, the difference. Well, okay. Question: what's the difference between the different elements? Well, obviously, like in a game versus a novel, games have choices. Novels do not. Hard stop. But they're not that different. You just have to account for shenaniganery in games, right? Well, if it's an open game. In some games, you don't have to account for it at all. You just go, well, these are your choices, and they're all going to get you to this one point, no matter how cool they think they are. Mass Effect. But you end up having to kind of adjust the plot. If you're trying to do it well, you adjust the plot in a game to a character's decisions and kind of let them create their own ending in that regard. I can definitely speak for TTRPGs over video games in that you should always leave some kind of plot development to your players rather than as someone like running or even writing a module. Because like the game isn't nearly as much fun when you actually get to input the overall story and it doesn't care, right? Right? Like you spend all your time playing these games, and you're like, oh man, I got to make all these cool decisions. But then you get to the end, and suddenly you're like, oh, that didn't matter at all. That's cool. Whereas with a novel or any media where you don't have any actual input, TV, movies, especially novels, you're there to be told a story, right? Like you're sitting there, you're an audience, you're there to experience it and immerse yourself in it, but you're just along for a ride that's already been decided for you. So like that major difference is why the mediums are so separate and why games are so freaking popular, honestly. Like how cool is that?
Yeah, that has happened as well to me when I'm writing interactive fiction. As a writer, I no longer have 100% control, and I have to give part of that control to the reader or to the player. And also, it's at the same time the point of games, the way that the players or the readers, whatever, can actually have some say into the story, right? To affect it and change it and perhaps lead it somewhere that is not 100% what you were expecting.
I mean, especially because you have to account for some kind of player agency, right? Like if you take it away entirely, then you're not really making a game. You're making an interactive novel at some point. And there's exceptions, right? There are puzzle games where there is no real point of like your choices don't matter. You're solving a problem. You're getting to the end. It's like a collaborative effort. But even in that regard, puzzles and games differ because puzzles they're just it's a puzzle, like you're just trying to get to the end of it, whereas games, especially modern games, because I think most every like popular game is going to have some form of choice, whether it's God of War where you're still being told this like one linear cohesive story, but you still have input on where you go in like quests, right? You get to do what side content you want to do. Occasionally you get to like be with a certain character and like which you use to go on a certain path. So there's some kind of it's like chipping in, right? You're putting yourself into that perspective. TTRPGs, on the other hand, is all that, right? Like half of TTRPGs is someone telling a story, but the other half is the players and they're controlling the narrative. Like they're actually in charge. Because as a dungeon master or game master, as we should really call it, because dungeon master is just for D&D, you set the situation up and they can choose not to interact with it, right? Like you could be, oh no, the princess has been captured. Like, she can take care of herself. She's a renowned warrior. I'm gonna go over here and be a pirate. And then your game master's like, oh shit, I didn't plan for that. So so like you have a completely different experience as opposed to anything. But that's the fun of the narrative, right? That's the whole point. And that's why you engage with the different medias, is for those different experiences.
Since you mentioned God of War and Mass Effect before, I think one of the key differences between D&D or role playing in general compared to role playing in video games is how organic one can be compared to the other. When you are doing it live, probably to some extent you can afford more deviations than when you are doing or playing on a video game. In those cases, you are limited by what has been coded, which can be done elegantly in a way that makes the player feel that they are actually choosing, that their agency is real and that their actions are actually meaningful. But at the end of the day, they are just traversing paths that have been previewed or foreseen by the developers or the writers. While perhaps in TTRPGs, when you are doing it live, the story is also alive, changing while they are playing.
Yeah, it's funny about that. Let's take Baldur's Gate 3, which is probably like the best game of choices ever made. Probably sans like a few very early experimental games, like a Mud or something, but whatever. Because everyone knows that's an error, right? If you look at Baldur's Gate 3, the only actual chaotic choice in that game is if you die, because the game never knows when that's going to happen. It always knows it can happen, but it doesn't know it's going to happen. Whereas it always knows one of the endings is going to occur when you get there. So you make certain decisions, and once you trigger enough of the code, it goes, "Oh yes, you have got this ending. Congratulations! You're either a good person, you're a dick, or just kind of meh." But my favorite thing about that is looking at death in that game, because there are certain, and they're brilliant in the fact that they actually plotted a couple death endpoints. Um, or you can end the game early by detonating something, which is a spoiler. But looking at that, it's a really kind of a cool path. That is the really only agency choice you kind of have beyond selecting one of the pre-selected paths is when you die, because technically death is an ending, right? Like you failed. Like that's the end of it. You're done. Like your characters are dead, but you reload your game, or you get to restart or whatever. But that is kind of like the only thing in a video game that matches that TTRPG element, because it's completely random. Like you can't predict that's going to happen. To a very lesser extent, you can say at one point you will die. But yeah, take that and apply it to the entire TTRPG element, which is why people love it so much. Because you can take, say, like Wizards of the Coast. They're probably their most popular module is Curse of Strahd, where you're basically fighting a Dracula adjacent vampire who is like your enemy and whatever. So you're playing that, and it has a very specific path that you follow. Eventually, you fight Strahd, and there's some murder and blah blah blah. Congratulations, you did it. But you can at several points, Strahd will show up and attempt to harass you, right? And let's just say that a player gets lucky, or they're smart and they kill him at the very beginning, and you're like, oh damn, like that shouldn't happen. It really, if you're, it won't happen, but it can. And that's the fun thing. And how much fun is it to just end a campaign halfway through because you just aced like a combat? Like that's the cool part of those narratives. That's really fun.
The organic change and evolution of those campaigns is what makes them so amusing and entertaining, right? But how do you deal with that on a live campaign as a game master?
Run a campaign, I've usually written it out, right? So I don't really off the cuff campaigns much anymore. You have to, at a certain point, you have to have a little bit of improvisation when you're running any TTRPGs, because players are unpredictable, because they're people, right? People are chaotic animals. But I always have everything mapped out. So the way I treat it is I treat every single game that I run as an open map, right? Open world. You can do whatever you want. But then I put incentives in some areas, and then I remove incentives from others. So if I introduce you into a desert campaign and there's just all these locations on the map, and you're like, wow, I want to go all the way over here. But then what I'll do is I'll say, hey, like, that there's X event happening in this place, and you don't know that there's anything going on in these other places. And if you ignore this event, it's not like it's going to just be there forever. It doesn't wait for you. Things are going to happen. So if you choose to not go to that event, you could end up going to this really cool place that you see and nothing's happening there, or you can't get in because you haven't done the things that allow you to get into that. It's actually a campaign that I'm running right now that I'm mostly done with, where that's the exact situation. There's this really cool tower and it's got a really cool name, and you're like, oh, that place is so awesome. And you're like, yeah, but it's a month of desert travel away, and by the time if you go there before you're supposed to, then you'll get in there and there will be a wall and you can't get by it. So so like, yeah, it's open world, but things aren't always happening in places you want to go. So it's a good way to give the players the agency to do what they want, but also kind of like put them down the path so they actually experience the story that you're trying to tell them, or at least events you're trying to show them.
Yeah, so that way you still pretend they have a choice, but then lure them somewhere else. I did that in one of my stories. Like the player can choose, and in that particular case, going to a room is a bit contradictory to what the character is doing. So you can choose it, but then the character will work a bit and say like, "No, wait, what am I doing this?" Right? And then offer you again another choice to make it more reasonable or fit it within the story. In that case, it's different because in a video game, you they can only choose what you offer them, right? But in a campaign, I'm imagining they can choose anything.
Yeah, at the end of the day, you can just not do it and go be pirates. I mean, that's the standard response if you're not interested in what's happening. What I like to do, and my more expansive kind of stuff, especially one that I'm going to be running for a while, is I'll set up multiple paths that will actually take you to different places and open up different events that still lead to a similar ending but not the same. So that means that, okay, you're on the world map, you're in your base or whatever, and you can go to XYZ whatever place. And if you go to event Z, you actually aren't going to be able to go to X and Y because they'll be done by the time you're done with Z. But Z opens up a whole other pathway in a region that you would have gotten otherwise. So you actually do end up creating real choice, right? Characters feel like they're like, oh, damn, like if I were to replay this campaign with the same DM, I could do a different choice at the beginning and I would have a completely different game at that point. So that's preparing for every eventuality is a really good tactic, and it makes the game a lot more fun. It's significantly more work though because you have to do a crazy amount to get all that ready to go. But it's what's bring people in. It's why those games just stuck around for so long, because there's nothing that really beats that gamer feeling of having made a decision, seeing the consequences of those actions, and feeling like you've actually accomplished something. When I beat a video game, I'm like, oh cool, I did it. I got to the end. That's fun. But at the you just played through whatever story that's been concocted for you. You didn't actually end up creating it, which is that cool kind of sub point.
Yeah, and also because it's not just about the plot, right? It's not about only the players having some say on the plot, but they also have end up creating the characters, especially during TTRPGs. While in a video game, in some cases you can create a character, like for example the Dragon Age series, but it's still framed within what you have, right? You have the classes, but you still have a backstory and you just pick which one. And in other cases, like Mass Effect, as you mentioned, you already have the entire thing created for you, right? You can play it as Paragon or Renegade, but you are still following the rules, right? It's limiting what that character is and how they can react. While in TTRPGs, the player can have a lot more influence in the characters that they are playing.
Yeah, it's you bring up Dragon Age. Like when you play Dragon Age, the first game I think is the best one just because of the amount of choices they give you. But at the end of the day, yeah, right. It's definitely the best. Sorry, anyone who disagrees, but you're wrong. But you're you're always either you're the Grey Warden in Dragon Age 2, you're Hawk, and in Dragon Age 3, you're the Inquisitor. You are always that character, no matter what you choose or what you look like or what your character does. And you always have one set goal. How you get there might differ, but you're always going for that one goal. And that's in that regard, that oh man, that's so similar to book narratives, right? Yeah, you don't get to choose the characters, but they're all like on the path, they're all who they are, and they all get to the ending. Whereas that's where the TTRPG always comes alive, where you can be whatever, man. I'm gonna be Samsis the bread wizard, and I'm gonna cook the best bread in the kingdom and use that to slay the evil vampire. How? I don't know, but it's eventually gonna work. Who knows? So like it doesn't. You have complete control over everything that you do. Yeah, you still have to pay attention to the system and whatever, but there are some games where they don't have that. So You can always use your preferred brand of game. GURPS, shall we, which has a skill for everything. You can make your bread wizard a true reality.
At the end of the day, it's not a one it's better than the other, right? I think that the both systems or both of these things that we are considering are useful to tell different stories. For example, I'm not sure if you played it, but Hellblade is an RPG, a video game in which you don't create a character, you just follow Senua, which is the main character, and she's suffering from psychosis. So everything she sees in the game and what you see there is meant to show you how she sees the world, right? To make the player experience the world as Senua sees it and the effects of her psychosis. So in that case, I don't see the lack of a character creation as negative. It's just a different type of storytelling. In the other case, when the players are perhaps creating their own characters, that can lead to a completely different exploration, to something that is more personal to the player, but perhaps more within what they are comfortable doing or following or playing at all.
Well, I mean, first off, to say anyone who engages with any media, like no media is better than the other, right? It's all about preference and opinion, and
Yeah, and what that particular medium allows you to do as well.
yeah, it's just what's your preference? Do you like watching TV shows? Do you prefer movies? Do you go for books? Do you go for games? What kind of game do you like? Yeah, so on and so forth. Like it's all opinion as far as that goes. And if you don't understand that, then you need to go outside and touch some grass or something. Like that's kind of an assumed part, right? You know that it's just a differing experience. I think with character creation, it's funny too because I'm actually currently playing God of War 2. And I usually don't prefer games where the hero is designed and created for me most of the time because they tend to be very specific archetypes or they make really weird decisions or writers get on like a weird tangent and it's like what are you doing, like what is happening. Or if I want to have a pre designed story with a single hero, I'll go read a book. That's kind of my preference, right? But I'm like I said, so I'm playing God of War 2 and the characters are all very interesting, they're all very well done, and I can follow the story, but the stories can be so much more personal to that character, right? And you get a lot deeper of an impact when they choose the character for you and they design the game around that, right? Because God of War 2 is like, oh, you're Kratos, it follows Kratos a very specific story, you get access to his history, you know what's going on, you get his very in-depth emotional responses, some great voice acting, so on and so forth, and it really draws you into that part of the story and it feels like a mythic epic. Now if I had created my own character in this, it would not have the same impact and the emotional scenes wouldn't play as well because I don't have all of that background. Now, I think personally, for me, I'd feel more satisfied with my decisions in the story because I'd feel like they'd be coming from my own creation. But it's not that kind of game. If I want that kind of game, I'm going to play Pillars of Eternity 2, which is all about, what your decisions are is what your character ends up being and what they do. You can actually be a pirate. You can be a privateer sailor. You can actually help the natives or crush the natives, whatever. Sorry, you can do all these different things in that game, and it's very personal to the player rather than personal to the story. So that's like a good little differentiation there between that.
Yeah, it's engagement, right? Like the interactivity and the influence they have in the story it changes the engagement. As you said, it makes it more personal. It's not a random character, it's your own character, right? It's the one that you created that you put up. Exactly.
Yeah, it's you. It's what your avatar looks like. That's why I love those games. Is I'm a writer, duh. So I like to create characters within that narrative. I never play myself as a character. I think that's whatever. So I'll make my own character and then play them in that game. And like, oh, cool! I get to like be part of the writing process of this. That's fun for me, right? I think that's a really good time.
Yeah, definitely. And talking about characters, something that I think it's a bit different between games in general, video games or TTRPGs, and books are the secondary characters. If you are a writer and you want the reader to know about a particular secondary character, you will make room for it, right? You will make room for it on the story. You will, I don't know, plan a scene. And then that scene will have that information on the background on that secondary character, which at the end of the day helps readers see the secondary characters or even the others as more rounded up because you are forced to read through their stories. However, in a game, you may have an ambitious story for a secondary character, and the player or reader or whatever you want to call them, they may decide not to talk to that character at all, right? And that changes the information they have and the perception they have about the characters.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. So to put that in like perspective, or just to reinforce that, I'm going to bring up Pillars of Eternity 2 again because Obsidian is an amazing design company and they should be more popular. But anyway, when you look at that, they have all these secondary characters who are companions, and they have these in-depth backstories and plots and quests, and you can just be like, I don't like them, and they just spend the entire time. You can either just miss them and not recruit them, or they just will be on your boat chilling the entire time. So like you can miss all that content just because you're like, I don't care. Where as actual, so like writing a book, so my book, The Soul of Chaos, plug, I did it. When you look at that, I have a couple secondary characters that I force perspectives on, and if you don't get their perspectives, it changes the story, right? Like you have to read their chapters, otherwise you're missing a lot of stuff that's going to make sense. I mean, the first one of the first chapters I do, it's about a good third of the way through the book where you end up getting this character whose name is Luce, even though it's spelled like luck, and that's just to fool everyone reading it. You get his perspective, and he is probably the singular most important character in the entire series, but you get very limited points of his perspective, and that's very intentional. But without him, without that chapter of like forcing you to see it from what he's going through, his parts in the future make no sense at all.
Yeah, and it's not only the character depth that is influenced, it's also the plot because those characters, as you said, may give you. I think I remember the chapter from your book in particular. I'm trying hard not to spoil it. Without that information, it's like there is so many other things that don't make sense that it completely changes the plot. In a book, it's less complex for the reader because they don't have to make a choice. But if we go back to the concept of the interactivity, when you are playing, if you miss a bit of information, what are you going to do? It may lead you into a wrong path or some place where there is no enough events happening.
Yeah, you need contingencies. That's the fun thing. So that's especially important in TTRPGs, right? That's huge with how I design modules and adventures and how I run them. I will always have a billion secondary characters, and I am always expecting players to either ignore them, kill them, or never encounter them in the first place. So what ends up happening is I have to create this onslaught of contingency plans of what would happen. And so what I end up actually doing in that case is I go, okay, so you can actually find secret regions or get different endings depending on the characters you interact to. So it kind of gives you like if you do actually seek out the secondary character, interact with them, and do the thing that they want you to do or a quest or something related to them, you get rewarded for it. So my players, specifically when I run games, they know to interact with the world around them, because if they don't, they're going to miss some cool stuff. And it's not like they're gonna get a worse ending, or they just will get different content that might not be as oh god, I'm trying to think of the word, because again, it's never less. I never give you an unsatisfying ending, but it's not as epic. The campaign I'm running right now, slash almost done writing, it's called Embers of Wrath, and essentially it takes place in this huge desert environment. And there is a very important part when you're in this city, which is one of the main focal points. And if you speak to a certain NPC who is an information broker, and you get a quest of his, you do that quest, and you find like a secret area off of that quest, it opens up an entire section of the desert that you don't get access to otherwise. And it's very specific, and you have to do things in a very interesting way, and it leads to a much more epic engagement with the final ending because you have access to resources you wouldn't normally have. So it's kind of like rewarding you to explore the world and engage with the world you're at. And it's all based off of a secondary character. So yeah, like it's a fun little, I guess, kind of an Easter egg version of forcing interaction as far as that goes. But again, contingencies, like what happens if they don't find that character? Well, they just get this plot instead of this plot.
You made me think of Mass Effect again. In the first game, there is this small, I don't know, super secondary quest in which you can go scan a bunch of useless mobs that are there in the Citadel. And it turns out that if you do, you get a recording, and that recording will give you information that it's actually quite revealing after you play the second game. It will give you a lot of information about the ending on the first game and things that may happen on the second. And it's this secondary, almost lost quest that nobody does, right? But if you do, you get this understanding of the world and the functions and the players in there that otherwise you won't get, as you said, simply because the player in that case engaged with the world and not only with a particular character.
It almost does to a point, right? Because you're forcing them to interact with these characters, or all this, the tertiary, whatever you want to call them, the side characters. But you are trying to get them to interact with the world in a different way, right? Either you're trying to see a different angle, or you're trying to get them to understand this part of the world, or all these different things or perspectives or whatever. So it's kind of the same thing. It just doesn't have the agency in it. It's that you're sitting there and you're being told a story. I mean, how many stories have been created of spin-offs from secondary characters, right? Or characters that people loved, and you're like, oh man, there's a story there, and you've explored that. So I think it's similar, very far removed as far as that goes, because again, the actual person engaging with the media doesn't have to make a choice there. But still, it's the same in its intention, if not its execution.
Yeah, now that you mention, I think it goes a bit beyond that as well. For example, not long ago, I read The Fifth Head of Cerberus by Gene Wolfe, and that's a story that makes you work for it. In some way, you have to read it. Once you read it, you will have one plot. But if you actually want to find more or comprehend everything that Wolf put up in that story, you need to think of it, right? You need to start like going and looking for the clues and try to solve the mystery and what happened, and there is quite a lot of mystery there. The book itself, it doesn't give you the answer in that regard, right? It just completes the plots that are there at face value. But again, you have an engagement of the reader towards the book and towards the story that is simply because you have to sit down and think of it. But it's not doing it quote unquote in character. So it's not the character that you created that is doing that. It's just you, the reader. And it's different. And in the same way, we can extend it to any other story or world building that has prompted a player or reader to think and try to find out the mysteries. Like, for example, the King Killer Chronicles. They have like so much information and clues soiled here and there. You can try to tie the dots and try to see what information is there and predict what will happen. And that engagement happens, but it may happen after you are reading. And it doesn't change the story, it just changes how you interact with it in a different way compared to a player making a choice while they are playing the story and actually altering the story as a consequence of that choice, of that investigation.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, I think in a lot of books and the way that people engage with them these days, and with the sheer amount of access that we have possible to us, we can just sort through content without caring because we have so much available. Is that we've lost as a whole, not everyone obviously, but as a large group of people, we've lost the degree of media literacy that lets us dig deeper into plots, into books especially, or really deconstruct narratives. We just kind of go, oh well, this is the story that's being told, so that's the face value. There's the my favorite meme is the really angry kid asking his teacher, or teacher's trying to say, well, what did you with this character? Oh, is it like Shakespeare or something? What did Shakespeare mean by the table is red? And the student is like, it just means it's red. And he goes back in time and finds Shakespeare, and he's like, it just means it's red. And that's such a naive perspective of media, right? Because sometimes it's not just because the table is red. There is usually some kind of deeper meaning when you're reading these books, especially as authors. We do try to do things like for deeper foreshadowing, or we try to give you more information than we're straight up telling you. Just because the characters are interacting with something doesn't mean we haven't given you more than we think we have. And I think there's a lack of ability to see that. And I don't know whether it's because some people don't pay attention when they're reading, they just kind of skim as they go, or they don't have to because they just have more to engage with, as far as that goes, or if it's just a different attention span. But I think there's a certain lack of that proficiency in really digging down deep, which is actually why I really like your show, where you do take the time to like deconstruct and look into things and like really spend. No, I love it, I really do. It's something that has a deep analysis to it, right? And you get to really sit with the material and think about it and engage with it beyond just when you're initially interacting with it. I think that's such an important thing that I think we've lost to a point. We a show comes out, we binge it, and then we're done with it, and then we move on, right? And then we move on to the next movie or the next show or game, or we do that with everything. But rarely, I think, do we take the time to really sit and go, man, what did I learn from that? Was there more to this? Like, did I miss it? Maybe I'm going to look at this again. Like, it's something that we're lacking that I think just adds to the experience so much. You don't need to consume everything. You need to take the time consuming what you are already interacting with.
Completely. And I wanted to bring up your book. This time I'm going to do it because you have the regular chapters, with the characters, and then you have these small chapters in between that are just epistolary fragments or things like that explain the world and the world building. They don't explain it. They are more like anecdotes or things that will reveal a bit more of the world building, the magic system, secondary characters, past events, and so on. I found it very nice because it hints you at what to look at, at what to pay attention. And the same time, you are getting this, oh, there is so much more here. It's done in a way that is very enticing for the reader, very compelling. And I wouldn't dare saying it is guided, but it hints enough to at least spark curiosity. And I think that was very well done. So my question regarding that was that inspired by anything or any of your experiences as a game master?
Kind of a little bit, yeah, because there's I really hate massive lore drops. I can't stand them. They drive me crazy. When I'm reading a book or I'm playing a game and suddenly I have to spend 20 minutes reading about one particular lore thing. Like, okay, cool, but like tell me the story and I'll get the lore. Like I'll figure it out. Context is great. But yeah, so what it was inspired by was me just not liking lore drops. And I'll be reading through a chapter. I didn't write the pre-chapter bumps until after I'd written the chapter, and then I would go through it and be like, okay, what needs a little bit more explanation here? Like, what is the focus of this chapter, or something that doesn't make any sense? Oh, okay, that. And I'll go into the beginning and I'll write a little piece about it. One of my favorites is at the beginning of a certain chapter, you have a note from Arcalis, who's the main female POV, and she's writing a note to the castle steward saying she needs more wine, and she's listing off the wines that she wants because they mention a very specific brand of wine in that chapter. And it might not make any sense, but now that you've read that little note that she left about ordering X amount of cases or whatever, you're like, oh, I have context. And it gives you a little bit about the world. You know that there's this place called Veldenan that has some really good cider. What does that mean? Nothing. You don't know anything about that country at all. Uh, until it doesn't even come in until much later in the series where you even like understand what they are. But you do know that they have some really great cider that Arcalis really loves, and that it introduces it. It's not from left field, and it's like something that you're like, oh, this world is bigger than just what I'm looking at here. Like these things exist, these are people here, and that whole thing just kind of influences the rest of the story. Because later, when I go, oh, this place, you're like, oh, I remember that. They have the cool cider, or at least I hope that's what you remember, and then it kind of expands.
Yeah, and I think that once when we talked before, you had given me a very good name for it, like world building by context. That while you are reading, instead of having the info dumps, you just have situations that make the reader or player be more familiar with the world.
Yeah, if you pay attention to just about anything, you can really draw meaning from context, right? Like if someone is speaking in a certain way and it's an initial greeting and they use a term you've never heard before, pay attention. You're like, oh, I know that's a greeting because that's what we're doing right now. And then from that, you can learn that term without ever having to look it up or ask about it. You've just used the context to identify it, right? And that's something I love to apply to design, to writing, to storytelling, narrative, everything that you can do, you can apply context. I try to call it context narrative, but as far as that goes, yeah. So I use that a lot, and it's a little unfortunate because that's probably the biggest complaint I probably get about the Soul of Chaos is that people end up getting lost, right? Is that they're like, oh, I don't really understand what's happening. I don't know what happened here, so I either gave up or like, man, I didn't have the greatest experience with it. But that's because I use that constantly, and you really have to pay attention when you're reading. You can't be distracted, otherwise you'll miss the context of what's currently going on, and that'll miss a world building a moment, and that might come back to haunt you later when you go, oh, this doesn't make any sense. It's like it does, it just was earlier and you might have missed it. Sorry about it, but also not really that sorry. It's a form of storytelling I really enjoy because it gets rid of the need to stop the plot, the immersion, or to have unnatural and unorganic conversations between characters. How many times has a character who should know something about what's a very basic thing in the world, they stop and they turn to another character and go, huh, what's this? And they're like, well, let me tell you about it. And you spend 5 minutes going on about something that's like, okay, we all know this. It's common knowledge in this universe, so it sounds really weird that you're going into it. And that avoids that, right? So when you have that context, you're like, we can skip over that. The plot just moves. These characters are very real. Hopefully the reader can jump onto it by understanding the situation.
Yeah, and that is something that may work on a video game, for example, or in a TTRPG. I remember I played an MMORPG once that if you found weird pieces of metal out of there, you could bring it into a blacksmith, and the blacksmith NPC will tell you specific details about that metal, a bit of the history, and what it was used for. But it was very repetitious, because then you had to do the same with a herbalist and with a bunch of others, right? But in that case, what took out a bit of the boredom was the interactivity. In a book, when you have that over and over and over, it feels wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things, yeah, it's all good, all good. And one of the things you can actually do with that, and especially in games, games are the best version of it because your character, whatever you're doing, if they know something, they can just do it, and then you can explain it to to the player in like a little bump or like a pause in a little tutorial menu, and goes, "This is what you're doing." But your character already understands it, right? So they're never going to explain it. They don't have to. They already know how to swing their axe. They're never going to need to be explained how to swing their axe. You just press A and the axe gets swung and the combo gets done or whatever you're doing. So in that regard, you can do this. You can skip over the explanation because we don't need it because we're humans and we have the ability to reason. Like we'll figure it out. You don't need to tell us everything. We'll get there as long as it's not super convoluted or intentionally obscure. Then we will get there, even if it's not immediate. It's gonna happen. It's also about adaptability of the person playing or engaging with that, right? Like if they get enough of that, if enough of that play style, enough of the context, enough of the explanation, they're gonna just kind of adapt to it and be like, oh, I know I just need to wait in order to get the information that I'm looking for. I don't really have to worry about finding it right in the moment. I'll get it eventually, and you can kind of train them in that regard if you do it well enough, I suppose.
Yeah, and you have so many games that actually reward you for finding bits of the world building, for finding lore bit, because you are so enthralled by getting the actual letters or whatever the quest forces you to do. You actually have a reason to try to find the world building, right? And those details. While in a book, you just depend on whatever the writer did. So both mediums have a thorough dependency on world building, especially because we are comparing it to books on fantasy and sci-fi or generally speculative fiction, which requires more world building. However, it's done differently. In one side on the games, you can always make it interactive. You can always make it a quest to have a reward or something else that compels the player to actually find the information.
Yeah, incentive, right? Because when you're reading the Soul of Chaos and yeah, you get those little like the bumps where you're reading about the lore or whatever. You can just skip them because the reward, quote unquote, you get is understanding something later in the chapter, or maybe you like the lore and you like to engage with that. They're not, all the same or equal as far as information it gives you. But if the Soul of Chaos were a game, in that case, then they would be like every time you found one of those little bits, they'd be a book or a letter or like an information exchange, and you get experience every time you looked at it. You'd be like, oh, I want to look for those because I'll get my XP. Now that might not encourage you to actually read it because you're just looking for a mechanical gain, but that is that. Again, it's very similar in its regard. They're not entirely separate. They still give you some kind of incentive where they explain something, but just the way that they're executed ends up being just a little bit variable to the different media.
Completely. And once you said that, you made me think of The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. On that first book, you have a bunch of epigraph or something like that, a small quote or writing at the start of every chapter. And it's written by somebody who you don't know, and they really don't make sense. If you are reading it for the first time, it just doesn't make sense. It seems anecdotal. But as soon as the story progresses, I'm trying hard not to spoil here, you find out that one particular character is doing something, and on the final revelation about what that character is doing, it ties up to all of those little notes being notes of that experiment. So if you reread and go back and more attention to what they were saying, you find out a lot about the world. just by rereading those 2 lines that you have in every chapter.
Okay, so if you're looking at those and you're reading them, you're like, oh, what's going on here? And they're telling you a story, but they're telling you a story without context, which is a really cool method of the reveal, right? It's like the mystery within that, that he's giving you a story within a story, but it's kind of separated on a meta level because it's a different genre. He's not like, you're not in the fantasy genre with that story. You're actually reading a mystery, and at the end, it gives you the huge reveal of like, oh shit, this matters, and then it starts linking and putting everything together. I think it's a really cool way to do that. Personally, I'm a fan of that kind of storytelling. Now, it's funny because if you look at the chapter bunks again in the Soul of Chaos, they do that, but on a much on a different scale because they can actually continue into books that are not out yet, and you end up getting, if you follow them all the way along into these different books, you're like, oh damn, like this actually matters way more than I gave it credit for, and it's this fun little reveal that you get. But one book can only be so long.
However, I think that this brings up another point in or another difference between books and games, which are mechanics, the rules that determine how the player engage or with the game itself and what they can do within that game. At least when I originally wrote only regular books, and then I started writing interactive fiction, and I realized how much understanding the mechanics also changes what you can do with regular storytelling, because it gives you that perspective of always trying to foresee how the player or reader, in my case, will interact with the game or the story. And then when I translate that to books, it gives me a different perspective. Since I mentioned the mechanics, I know that you are doing an entire variant of the D&D, and probably mechanics are at the core of it as well. What can you tell us about that?
Like, oh, let's do this. Well, I do want to comment on the mechanics, though. Mechanics are, and this is something that I think the current incarnation of Dungeons and Dragons misses immensely, is the ability to tell a story and link a narrative to mechanics. Mechanics should always inform narrative, and narrative should always inform mechanics. They should be married. They don't need to be separate in games, and they shouldn't be. In fact, in games, video games especially, you have this term called ludonarrative dissonance, which is when your mechanics contradict the narrative, right? So they tell you should be able to do something, but there's no mechanic for it, which is very common in games that don't have the best narrative team or writers behind them. I'm not going to name anyone because I'm not that much of an asshole. But yeah, so yes, mechanics are incredibly important in that game, as this level to them. And I'll talk about my variant in a second here. I think one of the best examples of that is survival or builder games, right? Let's take a look at Manor Lords because that's popular right now, where the entire game is based off of the mechanics. The story and everything around it is only possible because the mechanics exist, and you form that story based on how you utilize the game itself. So you actually end up creating the story by just playing the game, which is really cool. So one of the things that the game, the narrative, oh my god, the D&D variant, which is, it's technically a 5th edition variant because we can't say D&D because then you'll get sued. So that variant it's based off the 5th edition SRD, which is the free rules essentially that anyone can use without getting sued. And it's right now called Lore, Lore, and it's an acronym for something. I'm not going to tell you what because reasons. That one, it kind of takes what you have of that 5th edition rule set, and it just expands it so much and really digs into it and pulls that narrative out of those mechanics and kind of designs an interactive environment that's more set to that style of play. Right now, I have a lot, like the basic game is done. The only thing I'm doing right now is just designing content because content's fun, and it's something that 5th edition lacks a little bit is breadth of options. There's a ton of indie and third party content that fills that void, but the official system doesn't have as much. And one of the things that I'm trying to do is solve that problem. So for example, in 5th edition, if you play a druid and you're playing a wizard, the only difference is what spells they have available and kind of how their powers manifest, right? So druids are basically wizards, but they can turn into beasts. There's other more nuanced differences, but that's essentially the core of the difference between a druid and a wizard. And there's no mechanics that say otherwise. Whereas in this game, so I'm making in lore, you have arcane magic and then you have primordial magic, which is very similar to Pathfinder, but very different in this regard. And if you're a primordial spellcaster, you don't have access to spells that arcane spellcasters. You have certain powers that are based off of an element. And there are currently 9 different elements, and they each have 20 or so different powers, and they actually evolve differently than spells do. So they actually scale with you as you level. And they're much more focused and they're not as versatile, but you end up getting this completely different play experience if you play a druid versus a wizard, because you have an entirely different way that you interact with the game. And then to bring that back to the mechanics informing narrative, those mechanics of the element that you choose, or rather the elements that you choose, the powers that you then have access to, fulfills your character. So you can be a traditional druid and say in this game choose the animal element and the wood element, which gives you power over nature and the ability to potentially change to an animal. Bam, you're a traditional druid, but you're nothing like a wizard at all. You are completely separate from them. Whereas if you play a wizard, you have access to your very traditional spell list, your spell schools, and all that kind of stuff. So they are in the same game, in the same system, but they completely miss each other. And that ends up creating this really cool narrative experience where you can have people in the same world, but they are from completely different walks of life. And not only do you get to play a different game in the same environment, but your characters have a reason to develop along a narrative.
And beyond the characters and the settings, are you also creating the world and what they can do within the world beyond the character creation?
Yeah, so when you create a TTRPG system, you essentially, at least the way that I prefer to do it, is that I create a setting neutral system. Is what it is. So it doesn't matter what setting it's in. You can put it in any system and any setting rather, and then use that system to play in that game. So one of the things that I'm finding as I'm designing this is that, like, oh, you could play a Warhammer game using these mechanics, and it would actually fit that based on which mechanics you choose to use. So yes and no, kind of to answer the question in more depth, because when you do create a game mechanics like this, they will always tell you what you can do in the world, right? Because you can't, if you're playing a TTRPG with a set of rules, those are the rules and that's how you play the game. And that will dictate what is possible within the setting. But you can be smart about it. And if you create an elegant enough system, you can pick and choose which you use, and that can actually inform your setting even more. So one of the things I'm trying to do is every single mechanic has an optional or essential tag. And the optional tags are basically you can play this game without this entire mechanic and it will not change the essential balance, and it will change what your setting looks like. So, for instance, if you don't want to have magic in your game, then, well, don't use the casting system and that's it. You're done. You now have a low fantasy setting that you can play, and you can still use the system for it. And it doesn't completely like jack your play style.
First, wow. Second, that is so much richer. Basically, it gives you so much control and the ability to basically play whatever you want in completely different settings. The games can be very different one from the other.
Yeah, right now I'm in the design phase. I'm going, okay, so I know how I would play this as a fantasy game. Now, how would I play this as a Warhammer 40K game, which is space gothic weirdness, right? Which has a very specific style to it and has technology, but also swords and all this kind of stuff. And I'm going, okay, can I play both games? Can I play a traditional Forgotten Realms game? Can I play a traditional 40K game? And looking at that and being like, okay, now how do I design this to do that? And what I'm able to say, fortunately, is that yes, you can right now, because luck. I think I just lucked into a design system that that facilitates that. Yeah, it's really cool to be able to facilitate those different settings using the same system and creating this kind of robust way to handle it. Now, the problem is the amount of content you need to satisfy that, which is immense. And one person creating that much content is maddening, but a lot of fun at the end of the
And I honestly can't wait to actually see it or try it. I love games quite a lot, so I can't wait for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, once it's ready, I mean, it's basically all I post about on social media these days. But once it's ready, I will be for sure looking for playtesters. So there's a plug there, to kind of like put it. And I intend to give out the entire rough draft for playtesting. So I'm not going to do that thing where you can play it up to level 10. Like, no, I need to know if it works. So you'll be able to like create everything using everything. And see if there's any kind of glaring stuff like that. But I'm really excited to show it. It's very D&D, but also it's vastly its own system. It does a lot of really cool things that Fifth Edition does not allow you to do. Because I'm a big fan of older systems like 3.5 and Pathfinder 1E. A little bit less so AD&D, but I also have a healthy respect for those design systems and all that. But yeah, it just gives you access to do so much more, and it actually ends up providing mechanics that help creativity. Rather than some people think that the more mechanics you have, the more stifled you are to do whatever you want. But in some cases, and I think this is actually more common, but the more mechanics you have access to, the more creative you can be because there's already something facilitating how you do a thing. If your game master needs to stop in the middle of the game and create a mechanic or try and figure out how something works, it can slow things down. And they can also make a really bad decision because being a good game master does all not make you a good game designer. They're very different skills. So if you can go, wait a second, hold on, there's a mechanic for this, go into a book, look it up, and then alter it based on your situation, that just actually helps you kind of create in your own style.
Yeah, and you can create a million different situations that are perfectly tuned in for that specific game, right? That will then, in turn, I guess, allow for more organic development for a greater player agency at the end of the day.
Absolutely. In lore, all you have to do to do anything is you have your ability checks, which is when you roll dice and something happens. But each type of ability check has what's called a maneuver, and there is a maneuver for everything: grabbing somebody, attacking someone, disarming them, grappling, aiming at a very specific object, aiming at like a body part. So everything has a maneuver and a way that that maneuver is affected. And then if you come across something that doesn't have a maneuver for it, all you have to do is take the tags that exist, which are very specific, apply them to an action, and then all of a sudden you can do it in the game. And the game facilitates that for you. So, for example, there is a specific skill in this game called reflex, and reflex is entirely dictating your reflexes. Surprise. So, if somebody, one of the things that fifth edition is lacking, if someone falls off a cliff, there is no response to grabbing them, right? You have a reaction, but reactions are very specific in how they do and what they are and what they can be used for. So there's nothing that says other than the DM going, yeah, you can use your reaction to try and grab them, but that's not technically in the system. So what this system does is it goes, yeah, you have the skill reflex, it's trained. You can legitimately try to, if someone falls off the rope that they're climbing, you can roll that skill to grab them, and it's a very specific reaction in the system that you can, and that exists for you. So whatever situation you come across, it tries to have something already in play for that. And then again, if there isn't something there, it's very easy to make your own maneuver and then deal with it that way.
As I said before, I honestly can't wait to play it and test it. So I have another question for you. Since we touched both books and games and how different it is to write for each of them, have you found something that you can do or love to do in campaigns, but you can't do that in regular books?
In a TTRPG specifically, you can put someone in, or a group of people more specifically, in moral compromises. I love me some moral compromises. So very specific, I talked about Embers of Wrath before, and there is a moment in that campaign where you are faced with a very interesting decision. And it's mostly you get one of a certain thing, and there is a literal goddess standing in front of you that is preventing you from getting more of that certain thing. So you can't really get it, and she's offering you one of X, and you can't trick her, you can't do any, because she's just this very powerful entity that's like, hey, you get the thing. Every time I've run that, it has created a situation where a party of people, between 4 to 7 people, will sit there and argue with each other for an hour. Um, they'll just sit there and they'll go, but this, and they'll but no, but this, and then they'll get into fights. You know, it could actually lead to real inter-conflict among these group of people who've been playing this game and like vibing for so long. That's something you can't do with a book in the moment. Now you can have people who have different arguments over explanations or like things that the book tells you, but it's very specific to TTRPGs. These conflicting motivations that allow people to explore their characters and a story in a way of social conflict, which is just cool.
I think that those parts also allow for a lot of introspection for the player. As I have played Mass Effect, the first trilogy, for like so much. I think 300 hours or more on each game. And I always play it as Paragon. However, there are two choices. I have to choose Renegade. It's like in those specific cases, not going to spoil, but whatever happened is more than my moral compass can support. And I just have to go Renegade on those. And I think very, it's a fun way to find out more about myself, why I always end up choosing that. But It also, when you are playing with other people, or when it is a TTRPG and you have a group there, it also allows for a lot of character development, right? Because those discussions that you mentioned, they had to be done in character, right? And that allows the player as well to find out more about the character they created.
Absolutely, yeah, and you do end up discovering more about yourself, and you go, "Oh, wow, I'm way less greedy than I thought I was," or "Wow, I'm way greedier than I thought I was," as far as certain things go or are concerned, or "Wow, I'm way more willing to compromise than I thought," because you are always playing a character, that's for sure, and you should always approach a game, especially a TTRPG, as a character rather than you, because it will be so much more fun, and you won't mind as much when you lose, when you roll low or something. It's just a lot better way to play, but you still always impart a piece of yourself onto every character. You can't not, it's still you at the end of the day, and that's how you end up wanting to play, even if you're playing someone vastly different from who you are. So it does allow you to open up these aspects of your personality.
As you said, at the end of the day, the person's biases end up filtering a bit towards the character.
Absolutely. Even when I'm playing an evil character, there's still a little bit how I see evil, right? Rather than just a generic evil, because I can only play from my own perspective, even if it's a different character. I still have to play, a form of my own understanding.
It's time to call it a day. Writing and storytelling are such complex yet flexible endeavors, and I honestly love chatting a bit more about the different mediums. So, if you are listening to this, let me know if you like more meta talks like this, because I'm definitely keen on doing them. Feel free to like and subscribe and leave a comment. I always try to answer. So, that said, Greg, thank you so much for joining me today. This was such a fascinating discussion.
Yeah, I hope it was. So, yeah, everybody, thanks for listening to me ramble about random crap. Again, my name is Gregory Wunderling. I am an author, TTRPG designer, and a professional dungeon master. If you are interested in doing or participating in any of my content, you can always find it on my website at just my name, gregorywunderland.com. It'll take you right to it. Which has access to my one release novel, which is the debut novel, The Soul of Chaos, about a whole bunch of dark fantasy things. You can find all of my short stories and fiction there as well, which is a whole bunch of stuff, and it's all free as far as that goes if you want a few weird side stories. I have a fair bit of TTRPG content specifically for Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, which you can find on that same website, several classes for 5th edition, and of course, completely redone character creation and crafting and minions, a whole lot of ways to make your game a lot more fun. You can find the book on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and of course, you can find that TTRPG content on the DM's Guild, which is full of good stuff. And then lastly, lore is hopefully, maybe, possibly coming out sometime this year. I am working on it furiously, so keep an eye on it. If you would like updates for that, you can always check me out on Twitter, which is where I spam people at gwritespretty, or just type in my name, author. It might show up among the other amazing authors. But yeah, you could definitely find and follow me there, at which point you can always haunt my Discord and get development updates as I go.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing. And if you are listening, you will find all the links that Greg mentioned in the description of this episode. Also, if you want more bookish discussions, bite sized deep dives, and speedy prose analysis, subscribe to my newsletter. The link will be in the description. Thanks for listening and happy reading.